Well, hi folks, and welcome to another live stream. Great to have you on, and thanks very much for spending some of your Tuesday evenings with us. Chris Bates is ready to come in just a second, and we're going to have an interesting chat about Sydney property. A lot going on, a lot of contradictory information also flying around, so let's try and get to some of the real important issues here. Now, just before I start, remind you that this isn't financial advice or property advice, it's a general conversation only. But if you'd like to ask a question, you're very welcome to. If you put it in the chat, Walk the World, that makes sure that I see it. And we also have Super Chat enabled if you'd like to make a contribution or indeed get your question top of the list. And without further ado, I'll bring Chris in. But before I do, let me just say one other thing. There's still a bit of noises off, so I'm going to mute my microphone when I'm not speaking because I've got some work going on in the property here. And I don't want too many of those noises to come through. Anyway. Without further ado, Mr. Bates, are you there?
Martin, I'm here. How you doing?
Yeah, very good. How are you going? Nice to catch up with
you. Mate, life's
good. Good.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels a bit weird when you're on the other side of the world. I think we've been doing this for 4, 5, 6 years or something. So yeah, it's good to finally chat when you're in the UK.
Absolutely. And there's a lot going on. And I guess a good place to start though, Chris, is because you've done a little bit of rebranding. You've got a new title. So let's just fill people in as to what you're doing.
Oh, things have been good for us as a business. We took 2022 was a year of sort of set the ship for the future, I guess. So it was obviously a big change in the market. We've grown the team dramatically. There's 18 of us in the team now. We've done a rebrand. We won Broker of the Year at the Advisor Better Business Awards recently. Launched a new podcast called Australian Property Podcast, which is catchy name. There's 18,000 new listeners on that in the first month. So we've been busy. And yeah, absolutely a changing market. It's been really interesting observing it, similar to sort of that 2018, 2019. And as brokers, we get very early in the conversation. We can see how both sellers and buyers attitudes to decisions and their appetite for debt and their willingness to transact and their urgency. We can really feel it because we got a great litmus test for the market because we can have those conversations and see how they change over time. And absolutely, we've watched that change, from late last year all the way through to where we are now.
Yeah, and what are you seeing? I mean, I'm basically seeing lots of conflicting information. So if you look in the social media channels or the portals, they're all saying prices are up, but then I look at the Illawarra, prices are down. So clearly it's not a one story, right? There's lots of multiple stories. I always say the old patchwork, and I think the patchwork is probably more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, demand in certain pockets is stronger than other pockets, right? And parts of those pockets, buyers are willing to sort of go and compete on, and some parts they're just willing to say, actually, I don't love that property. I'm just going to let it go, right? And so, and supply is really different. Some places listings are still quite high, right? And some places listings are super tight. So, I guess you've got to always look at the property market that way. But in downturns, absolutely, I think it really is a flight to quality. And you'll see some parts of the market that, are much more resilient than other parts. And, so yeah, I do think and buyers are really reacting very differently to higher interest rates and the changes with work from home and hybrid work. I think that's a huge part of the market at the moment. People's attitudes to their confidence in moving away from the city. So you mentioned places like Illawarra. We absolutely have seen a massive retreat in our buyers unwilling to leave around the inner city, right? So they're not moving to the Central Coast. They're not moving to north of Wollongong. They're not considering big lifestyle shifts and moving the family up to Brisbane, etc. But they are, so they're because they're getting conflicting messages with work. I mean, even CBA came out today, for example, and said, we want to get back in the office 50%. And so what they were expecting in 2021, 2022 isn't really eventuating, and they are just a little bit nervous around, making big lifestyle changes and then potentially having issues with work down the line. So obviously the high density market's still in a lot of pressure, right, from supply, listings, and, investors potentially trying to get out and first home buyers being a little bit more aware that they're not the greatest investments. I think the Greenfield Estates area, the middle rings has still got a bit of pressure on them. There's a lot of debt stress building in those areas where there's a lot of first home buyers. But we saw the shift in all the way back in sort of October, November time. I actually wrote a post on LinkedIn and said like the best buying's past, which was way before, the numbers have started to fly through now. But we could see at that point, that's when sellers were at peak fear. We had clients buying amazing AAA assets, great streets, great aspects, great frontages, under very little competition. But by the time sort of November came around, there was very little listings and very little quality listings. And we could already see buyers' perception was actually, I don't want to miss the bottom. I don't want to try to get too picky here. I'm willing to transact. And because there was very low listings in autumn, right? Usually you see this in spring, so there's usually this sort of increase in listings just coming up to Christmas. And then in February, there's this other increase in listings. And both of those just didn't happen, right? There was just a flatlining of quality assets. And, there's still listings on the market, right? If you go into the suburbs, there's lots of properties been sitting on the market for 2, 3, 4, 5 months. But buyers are just saying, I'm not going to purchase that if I've got to pay 5% interest rates. It's just not a great asset. I'm not willing to go into a lot of debt, pay a lot of interest to buy that. And that FOMO, fear of missing out, just isn't there, which means that properties just aren't transacting.
Yeah, and I think the point you make about listings is really, really important, right? So total listings are way, way down. The number of old properties, in other words, who've been listing on more than 90 days, 180 days, continues to rise. And the number of new listings are really, really low. So the mix of quality of assets that's available have really changed. And a lot of the stuff that's around is actually pretty doggish rather than starish.
Yeah, absolutely. So people aren't selling out of good assets because why would they? I mean, to go into more debt to upgrade under, it's risky to sell and then be out of the market and get caught out. It's risky when you don't know where interest rates are going to be. Can you even borrow the additional debt when borrowing capacities are really tight? And so a lot of people are saying, I'm just going to stay here, do some small work around the house. And then and not transact. Obviously, you've got the transaction costs, etc. So we're not seeing many clients in the upgrader space move from houses to houses. We are seeing some people upgrade from apartments and things that are not going to suit them long term, and they're seeing this as an opportunity to finally make that upgrade, right? So people are definitely getting out of apartments to houses, but the housing market, if it's a good house, people are just sitting on their hands. And so that's really supporting that part of the market. We saw a massive increase in first home buyers, especially in New South Wales, with that under $1.5 million no stamp duty land tax option, which is probably going to end in the next few weeks, right? But that was definitely bringing forward a lot of buyers that were, basically saving hard for a deposit and just couldn't get there because they needed to pay stamp duty plus the deposit. First home buyers have been coming in. I think what's supporting the market now is there is pent-up demand in the market. People who just have been wanting to buy for many years, and they've just been either saving or they've missed out or they've moved back from overseas or they've finally sold something to allow them to buy something. So, but the only reason that's supporting prices is very low listings, right? If listing numbers doubled, then, that I don't think prices would be supporting as much as that because it's just not, borrowing capacities are just so tight. We're getting clients come to us and, it's 5 times income they can borrow now. And a lot of them are saying, look, that's just not enough. I need, 6 times income, to buy in the areas I want to buy. It's really tight for a lot of buyers.
Yeah. And this idea of borrowing power is worth just exploring, right? First time buyers, comparing now with, let's say, 18 months ago, some borrowers are now able to get 40% less in terms of available funding. And that's a huge difference, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So borrowing capacities have fallen 40% probably, right? 7.5 times down to 5 times, right? Interest rates have gone up 4%, let's just call it, right? I know the banks haven't been passing on that full 4%. Like that's the flow through rate of the RBA increase into what variable rates have been up on mortgages is not being the 4%, right? Banks competition is rife. It's ridiculous how much banks are, providing discounts to new customers, right? But let's say rates have gone up 4%, borrowing capacity has fallen 40%, but the market's maybe fallen 10% and now going up. So it's been surprisingly resilient just because of the human behavior of what happens when interest rates go up, borrowing capacities fall. people sit on their hands. It's like this Mexican standoff. It's like a stress test or a cushion to the market. It's not all the parts of the market, right? But in quality assets, what you'll find is listings get tight and the marginal buyer theory starts to play out, right? If listings drop and demand drops, then it doesn't mean that prices are going to naturally fall.
Yeah. And the other point there, Chris, is that the banks have started to be a little more generous in some of the refinancing parameters, right? And APRA's come out and basically given a bit of a free pass. Let's explore that, because that potentially is going to have quite an interesting impact on people's ability to be able to service the mortgages they've currently got.
Yeah, it's a good point, Martin. I thought things like this would happen, right? So the last thing the system wants, right, is people defaulting on mortgages and can't refinance. And so there's already been a number of banks trying to basically be able to do loans where they don't need to do servicing at all. So basically, as long as your new repayment's going to be under your current repayment and you've been paying that on time for the last 12 months, and you can prove that, then we'll let you refinance dollar for dollar, right? But what APRA came in last week and said, look, it doesn't make sense for us to buffer refinances by 3% because they've already got that debt. They're not taking out new debt. So why don't we just buffer it by an extra 1%? And that's increased borrowing capacities by about 20%. So people that were mortgage prisoners, I guess, as in they took out debt at a higher multiple than they can get today. This is definitely changing the game for some people because, we've already gone back this week and started to look at people that couldn't refinance 2 weeks ago but can refinance now. And then potentially there's a little bit of cash out there as well that they could get to support them with their repayments.
50,000,
they can re-extend their they can re-extend their loan terms. So yeah, absolutely. It's and I think this is what you'll also see when there is people who are struggling with their mortgages. The banks will do whatever they have to keep people in their homes, right? Like APRA will support them. They'll do payment holidays. Because naturally, it's not in no one's interest and it's not into the borrower's interest, right? They don't want to give the keys back and lose their deposit and walk away with nothing, right? They want to hold on and ride the wave. So, I can already see that sort of happening as well.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point there. Of course, the banks, the last thing they want to do is to have loans that are effectively declared as bad because they've got to hold more capital. So if they can find ways to duck through and weave and dive, they can keep their default rates really low and then they can claim that everything's fine. Of course, the pressure on households that it's creating is pretty remarkable. And bearing in mind that inflation is still very strong. In fact, there was a report saying food price costs are way higher than the standard inflation. And we know that the costs of mortgages are going to be a big deal. And we also know, of course, that the mortgage cliff is coming. So we know that the people are going to be having to refinance. How are you seeing lots of people on fixed loans worried about the cliff, or do you think it's overdone?
Look, it's like similar to the interest-only cliff back in 2020, right? Like ultimately, it's not just going to be this big crazy crash where all these people are just all of a sudden under debt stress and they're going to list on the market and you're going to see this massive increase in supply, prices are going to fall, and then it's going to be this spiraling effect. It just doesn't happen like that, right? You will definitely see in some parts of the market where there's a glut of people that usually first home buyers or investors that have leveraged up with very small deposits, very little other buffers, and high LVR loans with very little other financial resources or family help and are on one income. And absolutely those sort of areas could easily see, because the banks won't want to support properties in those areas as well. They'll be more likely to say, hang on a sec, we want to get out of here. Like we want to limit our exposure to this pocket. So they were less likely to give you a payment holiday versus an area where the banks aren't concerned about property prices, aren't concerned about debt stress. They'll be a bit more lenient in that area. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think the fixed rate cliff is going to be, is only susceptible to certain pockets, investors or first home buyers where there's a lot of people with high LVR loans and recent loans. For our clients, we had a lot of clients buying 2021, right, when rates were 2%, and mortgages are bigger mortgages than they can get today, right? So they can't refinance. But what they're coming to us and doing is, we're sharpening their variable rate, nowhere near what the AFR or anyone's reporting on. Like, we're getting variable rates at 5.4%, even though the cash rate's at 3.85, right? Like variable rates aren't at 6 or 6.5%, which, big market commentators are saying it's just not the reality. And banks are repricing existing customers. Most banks, even if they know you can't refinance. So there's one bank, for example, that is definitely just pumping their clients with the loyalty tax and saying, I know I've got you. I know you can't refinance and I'm not going to drop your variable rate. But when you look at a lot of the bigger banks, they're just repricing customers, even if they don't think they can refinance, and they're giving them, almost best in market rates. And so we're going through literally our whole loan book. We've literally finished it. We're going through our second time in the last 6 months and repricing all our existing customers. And so, the fixed rate thing, and people are a bit surprised. They thought their repayments would go up more than they actually are, especially once we renegotiate their variable rate. They're just obviously that's everything they've got, right? They're not just going to all of a sudden just go, oh, this is all getting a bit too much. They're going to start making cutbacks, right? And the last thing they want to do is sell. So they're going to do everything they can to stay in those properties.
Yeah, and the other interesting observation there is that the dynamics across Sydney are not uniform, as we said earlier on. But if I compare the northern beaches with the western suburbs, with the Illawarra and then closer into Sydney, the dynamics are quite different. And also units and houses, there's a big difference in dynamic there too, isn't there? Which is worth exploring, I think.
Yeah, so the beaches, for example, that's where I am. The beaches are definitely coming back. I mean, the whole hybrid work really suits people to live, on the beaches. You can already see very low listings. Not all properties on the beaches are bouncing back. The busier roads, the dark places, the bad aspect, the bad blocks, busier, those type of properties. But, there's very low listings of good assets on good streets, right? And, there's those must-do upgraders or the opportunistic upgrader are buying in there. But when you talk about somewhere like Illawarra or the Central Coast, well, those just aren't going there. The high-density unit market, well, families are going, well, that doesn't solve my solution long-term. I'm not going to go there. Investors are a little bit more clued on as well, so they're not going there. And, yeah, absolutely. The unit market in Sydney, though, the $1 to $2 million unit market that does suit families, those is really strong. And A, because of the $1.5 million no stamp duty, but B, because people are a little bit more stuck to the city, they can't afford the houses, and so they're looking for the bigger apartments, especially if they're in like more smaller, quiet blocks that suit families. And so, it's always a patchwork where you've got this demand supply equilibrium, and where there is a bit of pressure, on prices going back up.
And the migration question, of course, is that having an impact, or is this really a bit of a furphy? I mean, 700,000, the Treasury was saying the next 2 years.
Back in 2020, right, when migration was, going to zero and COVID, right, a lot of commentators are going, right, no migration, property prices are going to fall. The reality is migration doesn't actually then, and I said this on this podcast, doesn't automatically lead to buyers, right? There's a lag. What I think the migration story is doing, though, is creating rental stress. And the rental market is already under enormous stress, let alone migration also competing, right? So vacancy rates across the whole country, we've seen rental costs go up, who knows, right? 10 to 40%, depending on what the property is. And that's also forcing buyers, renters, and we're getting this, is saying, I don't want to enter the rental market. I don't want to sell and then rent. So, or I don't want to just extend my lease. I actually want to get into the market and buy, right? So, especially when there's little kids involved, to be honest. So the need for security and stability is much higher. So, I think the rental crisis is actually one of the things that is supporting prices. And we're also seeing not much supply getting built. We're seeing obviously building numbers are down, whether it's house and land packages or new apartment approvals. But we're also seeing very little demand from investors looking to do builds, but also home owners looking to do constructions. Like back in 2021, we had lots of clients coming, hey, I want to do $1 million renovation. But that just doesn't exist, right? A, because the building cost, B, because they're getting the funding, issues with valuation, etc. So, I think it's some tough times down the road for, a lack of supplies coming.
Yeah, and you mentioned the building situation. It's just worth dwelling on that for a second. I mean, the number of builders going up, falling over is still rising. In fact, it's the largest sector of the economy where, in fact, we're seing failures there currently. So if you're actually somebody who's thinking of buying an older property and needing to get work done, or if you want to make renovations before you sell, those are really critical questions now, because it's very hard to get and hold. And of course, the material costs are still rising as well. So that seems to me to be putting a bit of a split between property that's relatively, oven ready, relative to property that needs a lot of work done.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So like if you're a buyer and you're looking to get something that needs a lot of work, right, that's going to really struggle in this market, because buyers are not sure how much that's going to cost or have they got the cash to do it. They just sort of run away from that property. But something that's reasonably well presented, I think, would still sell quite well. And if it's finished and it's ready to roll, obviously that the market wants that, right? Like that, the certainty of not having to go through a reno and the costs and the and so absolutely, those properties are still selling super hot. Yeah.
And this is why it's important to understand the localities and all of those things. Now, one question that somebody asked a while ago, you mentioned some of the banks. Are you able to name the bank that's actually changed its underwriting standards, or is it a bit more subtle than that?
With the APRA 1%. So Westpac came out with that last week, but I reckon if Westpac are doing it, every other bank will do it. The banks will all copy, right? And some non-banks did it a week before that. So yeah, it'll be, I imagine all the banks will be able to do it, and borrowing capacities, for refinances will be pretty much across the board. We don't want to give too much of an unfair advantage to Westpac, right? So all the other banks will be not far behind, I'm sure.
Yeah, I suspect that all of them will be more willing, because APRA's basically given them the signal to say, feel free.
Yeah, and it's not really great for the banks, to be honest. Like, they're actually just going to eat each other's margins, and this is what's great for consumers is bank margins have been falling dramatically. The net interest margin on loans. The banks in the last couple of weeks have started saying they don't want to do cashbacks anymore, which I think is quite funny, because it was ANZ's idea to bring a cashback in years ago, and we just all looked at each other and said, why are you doing this? And then ANZ got absolutely flooded with new business, and then all the other banks said, well, it worked for ANZ. I'm going to start offering cashback too. And then all of a sudden, everyone's offering cashback, and the only way to get new customers to offer a cashback and a ridiculous rate. So I think the banks have all come together and said, let's not do this cashback thing anymore. It's a bit stupid. And in the meantime, they've been eating each other's margins, right? And I think the interesting thing is what we've seen with the banks is they're not been playing hardball on repricing their existing customers. I think they're all switching on. They're all worried about their loan book growth. They're all worried about people coming off fixed rates. And they're all trying to protect their existing book rather than just losing 2 out the back door and getting 2 in the front door, right? And then having to pay brokers and new customers, and then they might leave it in a few years' time. So, it's a real retention strategy. It's really strong, which is great for consumers, right? So if you just call up your bank right now, you'll be out of market probably, if you haven't reviewed in the last 12 months, probably 50 basis points at least. But if you made a call, you probably get most of that off your rate just with a phone call. And so, anyone listening should definitely be calling their bank.
Absolutely. Got to keep at it.
Yeah, and almost to be honest, we actually, even just recently, the last month, there's even more of a big discount that we're getting. So, which is another 10 basis points for customers that we repriced 3-4 months ago. And so, yeah, definitely call.
Yeah, shop around and keep asking, and don't take no for an answer, because they're desperate to keep your business. One of the other interesting observations, of course, is the funding costs for the banks are going to rise, right? The term funding facility is having to be repaid now. And there was an interesting article over the weekend. I think Christopher Joy highlighted some of the issues there. Firstly, banks have not passed on all the cash rate rises. You made that point, Chris. The second one is they've got this big pressure now of funding because the term funding facility is rolling off. So it'll be interesting to see whether they can maintain those really good rates, or whether they're going to have to continue to put rates up out of cycle to maintain margin.
Well, we saw that last week, actually. I said it to the team. I said, did they just do that out of cycle, a cheeky 10 basis points? One of the banks did, right? And I think another couple did as well. I'm not exactly sure how many did it, but yeah, absolutely. They increased their rates on their existing customers by 10 basis points. without any obviously increase with the RBA. And it's easy to get lost, right? Because your rates are jumping around so much at the moment. You know, you don't really know what the standard variable rate is, what your discount is, and where is it at, etc. And so, yeah, I definitely think that's going to happen as well. But I think the competition for new customers is so rife that, you know, even if the banks do this, you've just got to always stay on your toes, and potentially they go, well, if you're not going to take care of me, I'm going to go elsewhere. And I think what you can see is refinance numbers all went through the roof in the last 3 or 4 years. A lot of Australians are comfortable refinancing. They know it's not that difficult. They know it's, you know, that's just part of the game. And so the banks know that, you know, the cat's out of the bag. People can actually know that, you know, once you've refinanced once, you go, well, that's actually quite easy. I could do that again. And I think that's what's one of the things banks are worried about.
Yeah, and you can always call your existing lender and give them a hard time. Most of them will move. Retention.
Yeah.
So, first-time buyers. One of the interesting observations that I'm seeing is that first-time buyers are under pressure because of can't borrow as much, but a lot of them are renting. So, comparing paying higher rents with mortgage, what are you seeing with regard to first-time buyers and these new incentives? Are they really changing the game, or are people sitting on the sidelines and waiting to see how it's going to play out?
Look, I think that a lot of first-time buyers do fall for sentiment a lot, right? They do want to feel like because it's so nervous, right? You've finally saved up all this cash. You don't want to make a wrong decision. The sentiment has shifted, right? Like, you know, the CoreLogic numbers, you know, the media story, even there's just the general, even the confidence around like the Westpac time to buy and property expectations has really shifted, right? So a lot of first home buyers are wanting to enter the market, but they're just very hesitant on, making sure that they're buying a good asset. I would say that they're a little bit more educated. It's not that FOMO, let's just go and buy anything. But absolutely, we're still getting, you know, a lot of first home buyers out there. They're all struggling with the same problems. One, they can't borrow as much as they want. And two, they can't find a good asset. You know, they're always basically saying there's not much out there. I've been looking. And, you know, once they start to feel, though, that, you know, prices are running on them a bit, which I think is already starting to happen, right? They could already see that maybe if they bought, you know, 3 months ago, they could have bought this, and now that's actually more expensive. That urgency starts to increase for first home buyers, right, on low levels of listings. And so, yeah, the stamp duty up to 1.5 absolutely was a bit of a game changer for people looking to buy between 1 and 1.5 million. Their deposit amount they needed actually dropped by a third. So instead of needing a 15% deposit, they only needed a 10% deposit because they weren't paying stamp duty. And that's a huge difference. And if that stuck around, that would be a huge support for the market. But it's obviously changing only up to 800, in a couple of weeks, which isn't really where a lot of the problems are in the Sydney sort of first home buyer market, I would say.
Yeah, and the truth is, of course, that many first-time buyers are, you know, looking at this and trying to make these trade-offs and trying to work out what to do in an uncertain world. And I've said to a few people, it's really uncertain. But if you are buying for own occupation and with a long-term hold in mind rather than a sort of a investment switch again, it can still make sense, even if prices wobble down a bit and can come back a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Like all our first home buyers, we're trying to buy something that's the longest runway possible, right? And so not the idea of just buying this sort of suit my rental needs for the next 3 years and I'm going to sell it and then I'm going to move into state, etc. So we have a lot of conversations about what's their longer term plan, where they're from, you know, they've got a partner, are they thinking about having kids? Like, is this property going to suit? Would they look at some areas that suit them longer term? Like, how would they even, you know, a lot of people think, I'll buy something, then I'll keep it as investment property, then re-educating them on, you know, the difficulties in doing that, etc. So absolutely first home buyers, you know, need to take that longer term approach, which then, you know, takes away a lot of that risk of that, you know, short-term market, you know, trying to time it.
Yeah, the whole idea of timing the market is one of those myths. It's very hard to do. Another one is the concept of meeting the market. Now, I've heard a lot of agents recently saying you have to meet the market. So what do we mean by meeting the market, Chris?
Well, it depends on if they have to. And this is definitely the situation we see, right? So we see a lot of clients who come to us with multiple properties. I chatted to one yesterday that's apartment in Surrey, a pretty average property up in Queensland. And we've been having a conversation for 18 months around getting out of these so they could keep one property they've got, which is their home, and buy a better quality investment. But the challenge is actually the psychological part of the market is meeting the market, right? There's an anchoring bias. We could have sold it for X last year. I paid this for it, so I don't want to sell it for a loss. And so, yeah, I think a lot of investors really struggle to do that. And also a lot of homeowners do as well. So they, unless they're really forced to sell, there's a lot of pressure on them to say, let's just hold on for a better time. Even if there's a, deceased estate, you got two kids, you got to split it. They'll be like, well, let's just drag this out, right? Let's not have to sell, mum or dad's property because we know it's not a great time to sell and we could sell it next year for more money. So there's this real, desire to get a good price, right? Even just people say like this is that anchoring bias is I could have sold it for 800 in 2021. I can only get 750 for it now. I feel like I've lost 50 grand. Well, no, you haven't, but ultimately that's stopping you, meeting the market. And so that's why a lot of properties on the market for, 90 plus days is, look, if they wanted to sell, there is probably a buy there, but they're nowhere near what they want to sell for. And we actually are seeing quite a lot of listings get pulled from the market. I haven't seen it as much recently, but, I know at one point, maybe 25, 30% of properties, agents were losing. So they were getting the listing, they were getting the styling, they were listing it on the market. They'd try it for 4 to 6 weeks. The demand wasn't there. And the vendor just said, look, I'm not selling it, right? And so that's also, happening as well, where people aren't forced to sell. They just like, well, I'll try if I can get a certain price. I know you promised me you'd get me that, but you can't. So I'm not selling. Yeah.
And that is the point, of course, because if you haven't got to sell, then you might just wait and see what happens. Talk about property investors. Property investors have got this problem with higher interest rates. And whilst they can put the rentals up to an extent, in my calculations, I'm seeing more property investors who are actually underwater now from a cash flow perspective. And with the prospect of limited capital gains, I reckon that a lot of the property that's coming on the market is old investment property. Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like you're not going to sell your home, but you are going to get out of an investment property, especially if it's a cash burn, especially if you don't know if you don't believe it's a great asset, it hasn't performed for you. So absolutely, we're seeing clients willing to meet the market if it, especially if there's a little bit of equity in there as well. Like even if it's 50 to 100 grand, that can just give them 50 grand extra in their offset accounts, which helps support their repayments on their home loan, etc. So yeah, we don't really see many clients buying those properties, right? So we'll talk them out of those type of assets. But yeah, if they are in a bit of pressure, we've definitely seen, because they're also saying, well, I'm not going to regret it, right? I know this isn't a great asset. I've been wanting to get out of it for years. Yeah, I could maybe hold on for a few more years, but I just don't believe in this property, and I can get out and I can take a lot of stress off my plate. So yeah, you'll definitely see investors more likely dump in times like now, especially if they're not great assets.
Yes, and it's interesting because if you talk to investors quietly, quite often they know that they've got a bit of a dog, right?
Absolutely.
And they'll hold on the assumption that, well, maybe capital appreciation will save us, whereas now there's a flushing out going on. It's one of the reasons why the number of rentals is decreasing, because there are more property investors who've got out and are now holding equity.
Yeah, absolutely. So since 2012, I've been talking to people around property, right? And they come to us and we find exactly what do they buy, when do they buy it, what do they pay for it. And we can very quickly over, decade plus see what performs, what doesn't perform. And but actually, very quickly, like you say, Martin, I think people are very switched on to knowing whether it's a good asset or not, or if it's performing. There is a little bit of an overconfidence, right? Especially if it's home bias, they'll go, well, it's gone up, and they don't really know how to compare that to the market or what other things they could have done with that money. But very easily they can be educated around the issues with supply or issues with demand, whether it's a studio apartment or it's a new townhouse or a greenfield estate or, a cheap and cheerful rural property, etc. Like, once you sort of lift the veil a little bit, they do get it and understand why it hasn't been growing because the fundamentals aren't right. And yeah.
And there's a couple of questions coming. One which came in a second ago. Let me just, from Vanessa. What's happening to all those people who bought house and land, but their construction company collapsed? Are those people selling? Have you seen any of that?
Look, we do very little in the house and land and the off-the-plan apartment space and new townhouses, etc. So it's not something that our clients go near, to be honest. But we have had builders go bust on our clients. We've had even a new high-rise, pretty expensive development, to be honest. We've had a builder walk off the job, a month before. We've had builders go bust on clients who are doing in builds, etc. It's not a great situation. But it isn't very, down to that individual situation, what's happening with the builder. Some builders have been able to get subcontractors through to finish it off, etc. So, we had a client, like they'd already bought this house and land package before coming to us. And the land they bought it over 700. They bought it in the boom. We got a val on it, and the land came back at 570 or something. It was like 20% under what they paid. And they're under unconditional contract. They had to settle. They ended up renegotiating. The builder the developer actually sold the land cheaper. They ended up getting it for 650 or something rather than 725 or something. But that was a real issue, right? Because they wouldn't have been able to settle. And luckily the developer actually sold them the land cheaper, but they potentially would have had to walk away with their deposit there in that situation. So it's not a pretty situation. And we also send clients who have bought more of the premium end of the off the plan market in the 2021 when there was a real FOMO that was their only option. And we've seen developers write out their sunset clause. They're just not building. And so, because they can't do it profitably. So they're just going, I'm just not going to touch this. I'll just write it out and I'll take the sunset clause in a few years. So I think that whole space is, and I do feel a lot for the developers. They run on such tight margins. And those margins have been absolutely smashed because of building costs and labor issues and weather and so many other things. And it hasn't been a bit of profitless boom for a lot of them. And their revenue's down dramatically, and they've had to keep paying their staff. And it's not pretty.
Right, and I think we should touch here on the supply question. Right, building approvals way down. We know migrations up. This is going to have a long-term impact on the market. And my theory is that one of the reasons why prices aren't falling further at the moment is because there's a supply disequilibrium, which is going to be with us for probably 3 to 5 years. How do you see that playing out, Chris?
Look, I think it's a really interesting time because a rental crisis plus a housing affordability crisis means that shelter, right, is becoming a real issue. And it's also becoming a massive social issue, not only just the homelessness, unaffordability for current first-home buyers and future generations, etc. But it's also becoming a social issue because the desirability of our cities, whether talent around the world want to move to, our Sydney, Melbourne's, Brisbane's, etc. Right? When they look at our housing situation, they go, if I can't rent a house or I can't buy a house, why would I, move to Australia, even if it's a great job opportunity? So I think it's also an issue with our longer term as well if we don't solve it. I think there's a real pressure on the NIMBYs at the moment, right? So in the affluent areas where they've been very good at restricting new developments, you think about the lower North Shore of Sydney, eastern suburbs, beaches, etc. Where, there's been very little new housing stock has been developed. I think there's going to be a pressure on the local governments from the state governments to take the power back a little bit and say, right, no, you can't veto all these projects. You're going to have to start increasing supply, but it won't be across the whole suburb, but they will definitely start to put a bit of pressure on them to rezone the busier roads, the things around transport links like train stations and bus stops and things like that. So I think it's the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. I think they're getting a bit of steam up behind them. You saw Chris Minns come out last week and, also talk about building up is our only option. We can't just keep on going to, greenfield estates and turning farms to houses, etc. So I think that's one of the good things that's going to come out of this situation is I think there's going to be more supply in areas ultimately where a lot of people want to live. Like, we've built, for example, in Sydney, we've done it in Epping and St. Leonard's and Parramatta and around the airports. And we've built high rises in Little Gluts and Wallow Creek and, etc. But we haven't built them in Mossman. We haven't built them, in parts of the beaches and in the east, etc. So, yeah, I think there's a change of the guard probably. And, it won't just be this free for all, but I do think in certain pockets in these suburbs, it's going to be a time for change. So yeah, but that there's a lag on that stuff. First, it's getting through the zoning, then developers doing feasibility study or acquiring the land, and then getting development applications, and then fighting it through, and then appointing a builder and getting it built, etc. This is long term. There's a lot of talk around things like build to rent, and that's solving housing supply. It's not even moving the needle. Like you might add 30,000 new build to rents in the country, right? There's 11 million properties, right? Or 3 million rental properties, maybe 1% more rental properties out there. It's a great solution and I'm all for it, but that's only a slither.
A very small slither, and of course easily gobbled up with all of the demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
But one of the interesting things here is the move to go up, and certainly if I look around Brisbane or Melbourne, as you move out, we're seeing significant changes of locales. So even over 5 years, 2 stories was the max, now they're going 4 stories. And so the character of suburbs are changing very fast. And I guess my question is, Chris, for somebody who's lived in those suburbs for a period of time, they're seeing these massive changes, and that's a problem potentially. But also people who are buying in potentially are buying into areas where more high-rise development is coming. So how do you get your head around the evolving suburbs that you're looking at?
Look, I think you can't just sit on your hands and say, oh, well, they haven't developed here for 30 years, so it's not going to happen. I just don't think that's a viable argument. I think you're a bit delusional, right? And you're a bit wishful thinking. If you are still buying in these areas, I think Peter Chewett, we interviewed on the podcast on the Elephant, he's very for development, right? And it's funny, a lot of people are for development, they're not for development in their backyard, right? It's the definition of NIMBYism, right? I'm not saying Peter's not, but that's obviously what a lot of people are in this situation. So I just think you've got to be really careful, right? So you've got to look at your suburb that you're buying in or suburb that you own in and say, right, if a council was going to change the rules in this suburb, where would they likely target? And like I said, it's those busier roads, it's around the shops, it's around the supermarket, the train station or the bus links, etc. And you've got to know that, maybe I've got this nice little 2-story across the road, but what happens if that did change to 4 or 6 stories? I don't think we're going to get a situation like in Box Hill in Melbourne, right? I don't know if anyone's been there, but my granddad was in hospital there a number of years ago, and I was like shocked because I was, you've got single story houses next to 20, 30 story apartment blocks, right? It's crazy, the zoning, how high they could go up, but 6 to 8 levels along our main roads, in our affluent suburbs, I think it's definitely possible. And I think you just got to be really careful. If the good thing is though, like if you've got a house in a bit, 500 meters back, it's all tree lines, it's heritage overlays, and they're not allowing zoning in those areas. We've actually reduced the housing stock because people are knocking down houses on the main road. So there's actually less houses if you're buying houses in that suburb because they're turning them into apartments or townhouses, etc. And so if you can play it well, it's actually not a bad thing for prices, A, because stock goes down, but B, you can actually get a lot of amenities. So if there is really strong planning controls around what you can build, the design quality of those, I think this is what they'll argue. They'll argue that it has to be a high quality, eco, it has to be pretty, I guess, from the streetscape, like they do in, say, Northcote in Melbourne. But if it's good quality buildings done well, then you're going to get more people, you're going to get more amenity in the suburb, whether it's, the cafes or the bars or restaurants or even just a new supermarket or, sporting facilities. There's more money for the suburb, right? So I think people can be against it, but if it's done well, development's done well, and then it increases the local amenity, I think people will be a bit more for the development. And I think it's going to be a few test cases. People will say, I saw that happen in so-and-so suburb. Actually, that would be all right here. That's a really nice development. They've done that really well. So I think it's a little bit of, let's watch other people do it first. But I do think the power is going to go from the local governments to the state governments. I think there's a real shift.
Well, it's interesting in the UK, there's been a big debate about local planning versus more centralised planning. And in fact, the Conservative government has pulled back from the idea of imposing top-down and is saying they want more engagement of the local communities, but also recognising they need to build significantly more housing at the moment. And it's a real tricky situation because, of course, as you say, people in the area don't want it in their area quite often. And yet, what's the alternative? So it shows you that if you have a population boom, that puts a candle ultimately under rentals and then follows on and it comes into the development cycle too. And just remember, folks, a lot of developers are struggling at the moment and therefore they might cut corners. And of course, that's one of the issues, Chris, that we quite often see with new, particularly high-rise properties. They're actually poorly built.
Yeah, I think in this situation, though, those developers are going to be building into very low supply areas. And I think the thing to do is to say to those local areas, like, well, you need to build. There's not an option not to build. And where's going to best suit your local community? So is that engagement in the community to say, look, we really want it in this pocket. Obviously, you're going to get people who kick up, but obviously the majority will be saying, like, this is where we think is a good spot. But I think in those areas, it makes a lot of sense for developments. If they can, buy that land and sell those properties because there is a lack of supply. Maybe they knock down, houses or, small unit blocks and build 6 to 8 levels and build, 3 beds for families or things for downsizes, etc. I think there's enough demand. You can look at places like Double Bay in Sydney. I know that's an extreme example, but there's never a shortage of demand for apartments there, and because there's a real lack of, and people want to downsize into that area. So, I think there's it's an interesting to watch this space.
And you mentioned downsizing, and that's something I want to touch on before you close off, because there are a lot of people sitting on significant equity, and they're moving now into that next stage of life when they potentially are going to need to move. Of course, the 300k downsizing tax break into superannuation exists, and therefore many down traders might be thinking, but again, there's almost no supply of stuff they'd want to move into. So it's not just first-time buyers that are caught, it's actually the down traders, the downsizers as well, who are finding it really difficult.
Yeah, there's always that this belief that there's going to be all these people, get to their 60s, they're all going to downsize from these houses, and that's going to create all these baby boomers, right? They're all going to shift to this. The reality is people live longer than they expect, especially if one partner survives the other one, right? And they could, and a lot of them want to get carried out of that property, right? The downsizing is into that, the box, right? Not into it in a property. And another reason is because their friends are in the area. They've got so many, they're really scared of change, a lot of the people in this situation. And there's not great viable options for them. There's just really a lack of suitable options within their local because of the things like NIMBYism we spoke about. And their kids are incentivized to keep them in the property. They know it's growing for them tax-free and it's their inheritance. Even things like aged care and, Royal Commission around that, etc. So it's a downsize, a fallacy that people just, get to retirement and then downsize, etc. But what we see is the opposite happens, right? People try to stay in their homes for as long as possible. And there's a lot of innovation happening here, which also supports them. So you've got 2B, which is Brian Hartz's business, which is, lending to sort of people with equity in their homes. You've got innovation around downsizer mortgages coming. You've got government things around there. So there's also getting access to funding, which can keep them in their homes as well. It's getting, I would say, more relaxed. And so if they can still stay in their house because they could get access to funding, that's another thing that happens. So, yeah, I mean, I do think there is a point. I think if you talk to a demographer, I would say that in the 2030s, I was talking to Simon Kustermacher just this week. He says that that is going to be a decade where a lot of people do have to downsize because they're dying, right? But, right now there's not this, lot of properties coming on because people are saying, oh, I just want to sell, buy something else and put some money into my super. It just doesn't happen like that.
No, there's theory and there's practice, and sometimes practice and theory don't meet.
Yeah.
Now, there was an interesting question earlier on. I think somebody said, look, I could get an pre-approval for 1.1 mil, but given the uncertainty with interest rates and everything else, should I really grab as much as I can, or should I come down and buy something a little smaller with a lower mortgage? Given where interest rates are, Chris, what's your feeling in terms of how people should weigh up these sort of decisions?
Look, everyone has different lives, right? Everyone's got different needs from a spending point of view, whether they've got to support family, or they've got kids, or they've got other family they need to support, or things they like to do and spend money in their hobbies, etc. So it's really hard to give individual advice, to be honest. But I mean, if that 1.1 is the absolute maximum they can borrow, that would have been, let's just say that's 5 times income, so 220 is their income. That would have been potentially 1.6 million, in 2021, right? So that's how much the banks have reduced how much you can borrow. Everyone's got different income trajectories, right? Some people have got a profession where they're going to hit their cap to get that next jumps really hard. Maybe they're on award wages, etc. So, that's another big part of it. It's future, maybe they're going into a situation where they're going to have kids next year and they're going to drop to one income, etc. So it's your personal cash flow, not just expenses, but future income. Yes, you can buffer yourself with interest rates. You could say, well, I'm going to protect myself. I know I can get a rate at 5.4%, but I need to protect myself in case rates go up another 2 or 3 times. You could always be really conservative and say, I'm going to protect myself if rates go to 7 or 8%. But, there could be a cost to being conservative. If you, for example, reduce your purchase price, that could be 2 things. One, you could have a big impact on your lifestyle. You might get a 1-bed or a 2-bed that you have to outgrow, then you have to upgrade and pay selling costs. And 2, you could just get a poorer asset, ultimately an asset that grows lesser than by spending more. The reality is that, even if you didn't want to go into more debt, that could get you a better asset that when you go and sell that in 10 or 15 years time could grow better than if you bought something a bit cheaper. Something a bit cheaper might feel a better financial decision because you're paying less interest, but there could be an opportunity cost, whether you have to resell or, get an asset that doesn't grow as much. And so, it is down to the individual situation. The reality is, though, if you're using that money to get a good asset, something you could live in long term, you've got a reasonable trajectory of income, and you can maintain your expenses, then potentially you are better to stretch, right, and get something that's going to grow for you tax free. But down to the individual, Martin.
Well, it also depends on whether it's investment or owner occupation. Going back to that earlier point, right? Owner occupation is a long-term commitment, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, what you want to try and avoid is buying just for a couple of years and then having to move again.
Yeah.
And if in fact the choice is spending $800,000 on a property that will last you for 2 years, or over $1 million on a property potentially could last you 4, 5, 6 years, bear in mind the switching costs. It probably is not just a financial lens that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good way to put it, to be honest, Martin, especially if that 4, 5, 6 years, that was 10 years plus, right? And then they maybe could renovate that property and live there for 15 or 20 years, versus, let's say, the 800 was a 2-bed apartment that they know they're going to outgrow when they have a kid. They've solved their short-term need, but it's really stressful when you buy into a property and then you want to upgrade. A lot of people just, it's really stressful buying anyway, but when you're in the market and you've got to sell something to buy something else, you've got 2 transactions. And it's not just that simple of just selling and buying again. You've then got to maximize the sale price, but you've also got to do the purchase, and you've got to manage where you're living, and you've got to talk to an agent to sell, and you've got to, it's really stressful. And so if you can avoid just the stress of that and it not going well, plus the transaction costs by buying something you can grow into, the other thing is probably a better asset. Really, where there's a short problem in our property market is things that suit families, right? Things that suit singles, you can just build more 1-bed apartments, studios, 2-bed apartments, couples, similar, as soon as people get to the family stage, that's when there's a real need for security, stability, and then there's not enough options. And so if you are buying a property that's suits that market as well, you're probably likely to get better growth as well. Hence why the housing market generally does better than the apartment market, is because there's scarcity. It's where there's not enough. It's where people are upgrading into and people aren't leaving. And so, yeah.
And it's interesting, Fraser just made a comment about capital gains, right? His argument is that capital gains is exaggerated after all your costs, and with higher interest rates ahead, capital gains will be slimmer. A lot of people, I think, get trapped into a rather narrow financial analysis of property purchase, particularly for an occupation. And my view is that there's a whole bunch of other things you need to put into the mix if you're going to be thinking about buying. It isn't just a financial transaction. It's much more broad than that.
Yeah, I mean, return on equity is an interesting conversation, and the capital gains absolutely aren't as big as a lot of people think, right? When you take off transaction costs and holding costs versus renting, you've got maintenance, you've got council rates, you've got insurance, etc. Absolutely, you need to factor in those costs. But if, for example, you were investing, $150,000 to buy $1 million property, and that $1 million property, goes to 1.5 million, right? Like, and you walked away with 300 grand on top of your 150, right? Or man, you probably lost some stamp duty there, but it's that return on equity still, because it's leveraged, can still be significant versus, especially if it's tax free versus, having money in funds, and etc. So yeah, it is that, that leveraged return, as a percentage is something that you sort of need to figure out versus, just leaving money in the bank or buying some shares.
Yeah, leverage is critical there to understand, right? And
yeah,
the point there is that if the sums work, you can do well. But of course, it's also uncertain. And one of the things I remind people of is that liquidity in property is a problem. So if you have a property that is not one you want to sell at the price point that you've actually got, you've got limited options, unlike, say, shares. So it's a very different asset class, isn't it?
Yeah, liquidity is it, and every property's got different liquidity, right? So that's why it's so important at the front end to do your homework and to do the hard yards, right? So, one of my favorite sayings, I probably stole it from someone, but, hard to buy, easy to sell. It's frustrating. It's time consuming. You need to be patient. You need to be persistent. You need to say no to most properties. Like, that's not what most buyers do. They just want to tick the box and just get the transaction done, right? But what they're not realizing is, it was easy to buy, right? And they can tell their friends and their family, and they can tick it off, and their colleagues at work they bought a property. What they don't realize is the future pain that they're going to have to deal with. Whether it's, and that pain can be limited if they sell it at a really good time. So when there's FOMO in the market, people are, there's a bit of, they can basically get away with it, right? Because they've bought it, a property that was easy to buy, but then it was easy to sell because the market was really, really good, and there was desperation there. But if they have to sell when the market's not great, which is quite often, right? Like, that real FOMO doesn't last for very long. Even in the down markets, that real peak fear doesn't last as long as people expect. So that's what we were saying back in July, August. We were like, this is pretty good buying right now. Prices have come back dramatically, and sellers are meeting the market, and we're having clients, renegotiate offers when borrowing capacities are falling down, and they're rocking up at properties for great assets, and there's not much competition. So the same thing with that FOMO at the top of the market. People think the party's going to go for longer than it does, and it doesn't. That happened at the end of 2021. It ended abruptly when there was talk of rates going up. So, liquidity does vary on the properties. But in saying that, though, if it's a good asset, and no matter what the market is, if it's a hot market where you'll get a great price or a great asset, because everyone goes nuts for that one property because it ticks all their boxes. But if it's a down market, people are like, well, that's probably the best property I've seen on the market in the last 6 months. And all of a sudden, all the buyers flock to it like a seagull effect on a chip, and then you get competition. We had a client miss out on a property on the weekend, right? Lower North Shore, quintessential, nice frontage, north rear, pool, nicely renovated, surrounded by other nice properties, great street, great part of the suburb, great asset. And it went super hot. And the SMH pitched it up, etc. It went way over what they were guiding, etc. But we also had a client buy a very similar property back in August, September. and that was peak fear. It was probably a better property, in fairness, in terms of a suburb and location and the style of the property and way it was renovated. Um, but they only had two people fighting for it. They ended up winning it, so they still bought it under competition. That was when peak fear. Um, and when you compared what that price of property sold for on the weekend versus this one, it was dramatically better buy. And so you'd have to say, if you're a buyer, you would much prefer to be in the market last year in that scenario. So rather than a property that went super hot at auction. What you're also seeing at auction, you can go through the auction results on a Saturday, is that even poor properties are starting to go for, unfortunately, big prices. Like I'll look at it and go, look at the sale price and go straight away and go, that's a pretty average street. That's a south-facing block. It's got a bit of privacy problems. And it's getting competition. It's not a great sign. And you can see that through auction clearance rates. When auction clearance rates go, 60, 70, 80%, that's really a desperation meter for the market. It's how desperate, what will people buy the poor stuff? Because 60, 70%, well, let's say 60% of stuff, probably the good stuff is still probably selling. That extra 20% is the poor stuff that the buyers and the sellers are meeting the market. And so, it's a good sign to show that there's a bit of FOMO desperation building.
And you mentioned auctions. I just wanted to touch on this briefly because one of my observations is that people are still being encouraged to go to auction, put their property on the auction, partly because agents can charge them extra marketing fees. What's your take on that? Are auctions still the preferred way to go? And are there situations where you shouldn't consider an auction?
Look, I think a lot of agents are skilled in the auction process. It creates a point of, urgency, right? Because this property's going to auction, you need to get if you want to make an offer, it's going to go to auction on Saturday, right? So agents can use that as a tool. I don't think agents want to run an auction campaign and then pass the property in. It just doesn't look good. It's like pushing the auction date out. It doesn't look great for buyers. And so I think agents are, they do use that auction date to potentially sniff out a buyer that's willing to make an offer, and play on their fear of missing out to get that offer. Ultimately, though, no agent wants to have an auction, have no one rock up. The property looks very stale. Buyers just sit on their hands, and negotiations. The power's with the buyer, right? They go, well, no one really wants it, no one rocked up, etc. So. But yeah, they can be a great tool. Even if you can just get two buyers on that property, then they can say, well, we've had a formal offer. It's above the price guide. The vendor's keen to accept it because it's perfect terms for them. Do you want to make an offer? You've got till tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And all of a sudden the buyer's like, hang on a sec, actually, I was going to get ready for the auction. But the agent does that at the optimal time. The agent's not silly. The agent knows when they've got two buyers that are very close and willing to make offers, and then they start a little bidding war in between them. And so, auctions are a lot of the time just the smoke and mirrors to create urgency.
Good way of putting it. And I've seen a few interesting behaviours recently, not least, of course, because agents with lower volumes are actually finding they've got financial pressures to try and actually keep their business alive. So auctions are sometimes used to that. Now, I want to tell you a quick story, Chris, because I bought this property in the UK via Zoom. What's your thoughts about buying via Zoom?
Look, I think you definitely want to go and get someone on the ground. There's a lot of things you can't sniff out on Zoom, right? You can't even get smell, for example, right? But you definitely want to get somebody on the ground to look at the street, to look what's happening in the local area, etc. But Google Maps is pretty powerful. You can't do a building. You still need to do all your other due diligence and contracts and etc. But yeah, I do think it's really dangerous, especially a lot of people do that. There's a buyer's agent suggesting that they think you don't need buyer's agents, so you can just buy these properties online, etc. I think it's super dangerous. Not knowing these areas, because every suburb's got great parts and not so great parts, and issues, whether it's noise or smell or housing commission or rat runs, etc. So I think there's so much you can learn getting on your ground on the feet on the ground. It's like when people when you're buying, you get all excited, you create a short list to go and see on a Saturday, and you literally rock up at some properties and go, why am I here? It looks great on paper, the photos look great, But when you get there, you just realize it's off. It just doesn't feel as big as it is. There could be issues with the neighbor. The agents always do amazing with their pictures to basically show the best angles, right? And hide anything that's an issue, whether it's privacy or. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend it personally. I would be getting on the ground, whether it's using a buyer's agent that's local expert or flying up and making it happen. It's all too late when you sign that contract. You can't complain and say to the agent, "Oh, you didn't tell me that." Well, it was never in your interest to tell you that.
We'll make a couple of points. I'll just check my audio. Yeah. I know the area really well, so over 20, 30 years. And I also had a local family member walk through the property.
Yeah.
And then I actually got a complete structural survey done. So I knew precisely what I was getting into. And so it just wasn't all done on Zoom. But the point was I didn't have any way I could fly to the UK to be able to have a look at the time. Yeah. And, it worked out well for me. I'm loving it here. And the new DFA HQ is coming quite nicely, waiting for the container to arrive. But I do think this Zoom issue is becoming quite interesting and important for many people, because I have heard of people who don't do the other due diligence. They just rely on the Zoom call. And as you say, it doesn't tell you the whole story.
Yeah, and you've got to be really careful with building and pests, etc. When we saw a client just recently, so I was buying not too far from where you used to live, Martin, actually, down that way. And the real estate agents, building and pest, which we never advise clients to do. We told them to use a different person. They went and did their own building and pest and realized the bathrooms, that two of the bathrooms, the roof hadn't been done well. Now, the real estate's building and pest picked up none of that, right? And it was all pretty easy to be found out. I mean, yeah, they had to use a special tool to sort of get in and find these things, but on the real estate report said, we couldn't get access to that. And so, yeah, that's another thing is you've got to get a really quality building and pest done by someone a bit independent. And yeah, rather than skip that step.
Well, to be honest, the report provided by the vendor is more marketing tool than it being a comprehensive report of the property, right? People need to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we're coming towards the end of the show, but Chris, what's your sense over the next 6 to 12 months? How do you see the property market in Sydney evolving? Is it going to go same as? Is it going to drop? Is it going to go up? And what are the sort of the precursors that you're looking at which might actually indicate where it might be heading?
Look, I've been coming on here for 4 or 5 years, Martin. My tune hasn't changed, right? If you go back and watch our earlier videos, the same things that we were recommending to our clients back then are exactly the same thing now, right? Look, if you're looking to enter the market, I think it's pretty wishful thinking that there's going to be this crash, right? Especially in the quality assets, low supply and demand and pent up demands there. Like we've had more pre-approvals now than we probably ever have, right? Buyers are there. They're just, are patient waiting for the right property, right? So I think there is a bit of a handbrake on the prices though. Like I don't think you're going to start to see prices jump 20 or 30%. I just don't think there's the borrowing capacity there to push prices up dramatically. I think the pent up demand in borrowers is going to run out of steam. And so you really need these new borrowers to enter to want to upgrade and take on debt. Now, when are they going to do that? Well, I think they're going to do that when there's real clarity around interest rates, but you could easily see that, right? Like I know RBA went up last month, but that was a 0% market expectation. So, if their rates do go up 1 or 2 times or they don't, then there's this plateauing in rates and then there's talk of rate cuts, right? And if rates start to happen and buyers start to factor in that they go, well, inflation's under control, rate cuts are going to start to happen quite significantly. That would also be the time that APRA would step in, I believe, to say, look, our assessment rate doesn't make sense. Why are we buffeting ourselves on a 3% assessment rate when rates are falling on very high rates? So you could see a double whammy. You could see borrowing capacities increase as rates drop, but also borrowing capacities could increase. APRA could come in quite significantly and cut the assessment rate, which would increase borrowing capacities, which would support our construction industry, which would support new builds, because they're definitely going to want to do things to support the construction industry. Absolutely, it's a big part of our economy. And so if, for example, we get that scenario where rates go up a little bit, but then there's talk of cuts, inflation's under control, there's rate cuts and borrowing capacities are going up, we're still going to see a supply lag, because sellers aren't going to be selling till that's already happened. And so you're going to see this real tightening of supply. I don't think you're going to see these people, especially in the housing market, start listing their properties until they can find other properties on the market. So as prices go up, then more listings come. So waiting for listings is a bit of a false reality, right? Like by the time the listings come, prices are more expensive and maybe you can't afford it. So I do think there's debt stress. There's issues in house and land. I do think there's issues that are getting a little bit buffeted in the high density just because of our rental stress and borrowing capacities are forcing buyers to go there a little bit. But yeah, I think the market is, like you say, patch. But I do think the regions, the first tier, the second tier non-commutable regions, like 2-3 hours away from our capital city, I think they're in for a tough time because I think the hybrid work thing is going to be battled out, some type of 2-3 days in the office. But the commutable regions like the Central Coast, the Wollongongs, the Geelong, Mornington, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, I think once people do get confidence that it is only 2 days a week in the city, there is a fear around jobs that we are seeing some redundancy, that confidence to just switch your employer and move to a region. I just don't think it's there. So I think the upper end of the regional market is actually pretty good time, because the last thing you want to be buying in those areas is when the buyers are back. And especially if you can be super patient and wait for those better parts and the better streets, I think that that's a good time, because that buyers will also move to those regions when they can't afford the capital city. They're forced to make that lifestyle shift, not just they want to, but they're also forced to. So if the Sydney housing and the Melbourne and the Brisbane housing markets start to recover, that will also make that more affordable and more enticing for people to move to those first commutable lifestyle regions, especially if they get the hybrid work starts to get sorted. So yeah, I think there is a handbrake on prices, but you could easily see a 5-10% increase in prices, right? Where, that pent up demand everyone starts to stretch and they start to compete on property, which is what we've already seen. So yeah, that would be my overall take.
Well, thank you. And I think that's a good summary, Chris, because there are quite a few variables. Right? We don't know quite precisely what the RBA is going to do. RBA might put rates up slightly higher. The trajectory is all over the place at the moment in terms of where you look. So it'll be interesting. Before we close, if people want to find out more about you, what you do, where should they go?
So we just rebranded. So our new business is called Blusk, BLUSK.au. So play on Blue Sky. So if you go to blusk.au, you can find us there. You can track us on LinkedIn, Chris Bates, Australian Property Podcast. We've got 17,000 listeners or something crazy in our first month. So check us out on iTunes there. But yeah, there's a few ways you can reach out to us.
Chris, well, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciated your time today and for your insights as always. We've been doing this for well over 4 years now.
Yeah.
And
thanks, Martin. I look forward to chatting in a few months' time. It'd be good to see what actually happens.
Absolutely right. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to close the show.
Cheers.
And just to tell you that next week, Robbie Barwick's on. We're going to be talking about the regional banking inquiry and also some of the broader political issues. So look out for that. And check out the shows in the week. We're putting up shows most day. And Vanessa, you asked about Doggy Cam. My stuff is due to arrive the middle of next month now. So it will be a few more weeks before I can do the Doggy Cams live, but maybe I'll do a show before that, just with the dogs, because they're loving the environment here, chasing the squirrels in particular. So thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate your attendance tonight and all the questions. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.